As I can remember, I was raised in a Catholic family and was always intrigued by the Bible stories. In some ways, I kinda liked them more than my family did. I would ask questions to know more and even dig into some of the Jesus movies. But if there's one scene that always brought me fear, was the crucifixion. To see a man hanging on a stake in the most violent way was too disturbing for me as a kid. If I ever saw a Jesus movie, I would instantly skip the suffering scenes. Even just a fist punch or scourging was too much for me. So when I heard there would be a 2-hour-long movie making the past Jesus sufferings look like pre-kindergarten plays compared to this, my heart was pumping blood cells of fear every time they would show his bloody face on a commercial. So obviously, I avoided it. But as always, remained curious about the movie. Then 1 year later, after its release, I'm at my grandparents' house, flipping the channel, and then I get an unpleasant surprise. The Passion just barely started. As my fear and curiosity for the movie grew, I was debating in my head whether to skip it or watch it. So hesitantly, I took a pillow so I could cover up the most violent scenes and had the remote control to turn the volume down so I wouldn't hear any of the screams. And let me just say, it was the hardest movie to get through. Then a few months later, it premiered on my house cable. It would be shown weekly, and of course, curiosity, then pillow, remote control, disturbed laughter. And that cycle will repeat over and over. Then the more I saw it, the more I got used to the imagery that I slowly put the pillow down and once in a while raised the volume when it felt safe. So now that I saw it for the 37th time, I was ready to see the film in its full glory. This time with no pillows to cover up and all volume raised up as loud as it could be. And after finally seeing the movie completely 37 views later, I liked it. Yeah, I kinda liked it. And it's probably not a popular opinion. So if you're wondering why would I like something so ugly and so cruel, bear with me because I've been waiting so long to do a passion topic, and I'm gonna take all time in the world to talk about everything surrounding it. Starting now. The Passion of the Christ was released on February 2004. It was one of the top 5 grossing movies in the US and the most talked about of the year. Speaking from my experience, you couldn't escape it from conversations. The media hyped it up for not just being the most violent depiction of the final 12 hours of Jesus, but included Mel Gibson's name as the director. Coming from a big star like him back then, there was some curiosity as to know how it would turn out to be. Friends from my elementary school would sneak into the movie. Family members of mine that saw it would bring it into conversation. There were some concerns whether if it would make any money at all. Most of the major studios rejected Mel's project due to its language barrier being Latin and Aramaic instead of English, which would be subtitled instead. Plus, adding an R rating for its violence would diminish the lack of attendance. It was more risque to rely with unknown European and Italian actors in a Western marketing. Monica Bellucci, who plays Mary Magdalene, was the better known of the Italian actors for her American roles in Bram Stoker's Dracula and The Matrix Reloaded. Jim Caviezel would be the only American actor in the movie playing the role of Jesus. Before this, he was an upcoming star coming out from Thin Red Line and Count of Monte Cristo, but he was still very unknown and unrecognizable as a household name. Since no studio would fund the movie, Mel Gibson would fund it himself and distribute it to an indie production that he, along with Bruce Davey, funded in 1989, known as Icon Production. In late 2003, he would team up with Christian organizations to help him market the film through word of mouth. They would show early screenings to Christian communities, evangelical pastors, churches, youth groups, TV ministers to promote it to their congregations. Plus, adding the media hyping it up for its violence, it became the highest grossing rated R film of all time, getting their $30 million budget back to a $600 million at the box office. There were some criticisms as usual when it comes to religion. Roger Ebert would defend it from its criticisms while admitting it was the most violent movie he ever saw. But some felt it went too far with its brutality and how it portrayed the Jews, along with how little to no context it provided. If you're not familiar with the story, then you wouldn't know what's going on. Why was there so much animosity against Jesus? As much as the film tried to give a little context with the flashbacks, some would remain confused. It's like if the movie started at the climax and ended at the climax. Well, if you don't mind me giving a little more context as I explain some of its background. Let's look at a few misconceptions. In movies and plays, the trial of Jesus is interpreted with a mob of peasant Jews who called out for his death. But the movies fail to explain what made the people turn against Jesus. How did they call him King of the Jews one day and the other accuse him of being King of the Jews? Even the Passion makes it clear that it makes no sense. In the Bible, Jesus was well accepted as a prophet and as a messianic king to the peasant people. In the first century, the Jews were under a stressful time period, being politically and religiously mistreated. The Romans would overly tax them, play to their religious sensibilities, and enforce brutality over them. Their elder priests would subjugate them to follow man-made laws that were not faithful to the more God-given laws of Moses, known as the Torah. The Pharisees were popular and acceptable to the common people, but were very strict to keep the Torah sacred. In doing so, they would add new laws to protect the old one, but made it difficult for the people to follow after. When Jesus came into the picture, he preached solely on the Mosaic laws, discrediting the elders' authority and exposing their man-made laws. What led him to headbutt with the elder leaders was purely based on doctrine. They as well rejected him as a Messiah because they believed that a Pharisee would be the Messiah, and since Jesus didn't belong in any of their Jewish scholarly educations, they found no credibility in him. But his knowledge of the law was revolutionary at that time, when as the leaders were preaching them to hate non-Jews, Jesus was teaching them the opposite, instead to love their enemies and turn the other cheek. So it wasn't the Jewish people that rejected him. It was their leaders who did, in order to keep the people under control and hold their position of power. These were not 5 or 6 elders in total, there were thousands of them, so they would have been enough to fill in a room with an angry mob of elder priests, and some Jewish peasants as well. Another misconception is that Jesus intentionally created a new religion known as Christianity. But according to the Mosaic laws, creating another religion that didn't convey the worship of Yahweh was a sin and against their law. If Jesus created a new religion, then he would have sinned and would have contradicted the Gospels that said he had no sin. If I may say so, from a cultural standpoint, the Bible was not meant to be taught by Christians, but by Jews. Jesus was Jewish and spoke like a Jew and interpreted the scriptures like a Jew for the Jews, and so later other Jews could teach it to non-Jews. Christianity comes from Roman European culture that intended to unite all religions while maintaining their anti-Semitic attitude towards Jews. Roman Emperor Constantine did not only make Christianity the official religion, but following his actions would lead to the canon of the Jewish scriptures and the Gospels into the Bible. But from then on, the Bible would be interpreted from a Roman, Greek mindset, divorcing itself from its Jewish roots to promote non-Jews as the new chosen people of God, and not the Jews. In the movie, Mel Gibson took liberties to add scenes that do not appear in the Bible, claiming to be for artistic purposes, and to fill in the 2-hour length since the Passion sections only take up for 2.5 pages. One of the changes were Pontius Pilate's portrayal as conflicted and sympathetic, unlike his ruthless counterpart that killed thousands of Jews and even got him removed from governor because of that. Mary Magdalene is the adulterer Jesus saves from the Pharisees. In the Bible, Magdalene was not the adulterer or any type of sex symbol we label her as. She's only mentioned to be a follower of Christ after being delivered from 7 demons. I assume it was placed there to add some connection to each other, just like Mary and John had their own connection with him through flashbacks. Simon of Cyrene, the man who helps Jesus carry the cross, is called out to be a Jew when in fact he wasn't a Jew. You can tell by his name that he came from here and was just visiting here. I guess it was also another way to have a good Jewish character from the few they have. In the opening, Satan shows up in the Garden of Gethsemane tempting Jesus, but Satan doesn't appear before his arrest in the Bible. So where did Mel Gibson get this idea from? Well, coming from his Catholic background, the Passion was mostly influenced by a 17th century vision of the Dolores Passion. It's about a nun envisioning the details of how gruesome the violence was towards Jesus. It includes Satan appearing in the garden and how the Jews were made to look like savages. Speaking of which, I feel like the controversy surrounding it is much more interesting than the movie itself. Whatever message it had about salvation and redemption has gone overlooked by its anti-Semitic allegations. So, let me clarify who got Jesus killed from a technical standpoint: the Romans and the priest. If you're a religious fella, then from its spiritual standpoint, humanity caused his death so we could later find redemption and forgiveness. But based from misconceptions of movies and plays, the Jews have been depicted as an angry mob of bloodthirsty extremist peasants who called out for his death. When the Passion came out, there were some concerns whether this would fuel another anti-Semitic persecution as before. Passion plays were done way back in medieval days to blame the Jews for the killing of Christ. It would get them persecuted and killed back when it was okay for a Christian to hate a Jew. The depictions in the movie don't help much either, as the antagonists are obviously portrayed as evil men based from their ugly features. Mel Gibson was recommended to remove a line where Caiaphas says, "Let his blood be in our children's heads," to what many interpret as the Jews taking credit for killing Christ. But he didn't. It wasn't subtitled, but you can still hear it in the background. Now, I don't like to sound preachy in reviews, but I want to give a little context to the meaning of this line. The blood phrase was not meant to be a generation curse. Blood was used in a positive connotation in the Bible. In some passages, it talks about how it was used to cover up the people's sins until God granted them his own sacrifice to forgive their sins. Blood makes atonements for one's life. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. He made the people holy through his own blood. His blood purified us from all sin. So as brutal as it may sound, this line was just meant to be a blessing instead. Whether you agree with this bloody method or not, that's completely up to you. But that wouldn't stop many interpreting it as a finger pointer against Jews. It then evolved from a theological debate to a personal question. Was Mel Gibson anti-Semitic? If I may speculate, the elders that run Hollywood who are Jewish might have been offended for how big of a success this movie was at the box office because of what it represents to them, and perhaps might have turned against Mel. The media exploited his personal life to the point of ruining his image, and has still struggled to be welcomed back by the mainstream. His father was well exploited as an extreme Holocaust-denying Catholic to fuel some of the anti-Semitic allegations against Mel. Things would get from bad to worse after his 2006 arrest from intoxication, where he responded to the officer with anti-Semitic comments. So now this raised a whole lot of confusion. What were his true intentions in making this film? Was there an anti-Semitic agenda behind it? So, as you might guess, I'm not in the bandwagon to mock Mel for all of his mistakes. As much as other things would later come out, like his abusive allegations, enraging recordings, and unprofessional attitude, I can see why people may no longer respect him. Then again, the media is well known for ruining public images on a daily basis. What I will say is, I believe there is a dark side to Mel Gibson. I think he's genuine about his beliefs and has given a lot of thought about his fate. Maybe he has come up with a moral standard so high to reach, either he's good or none at all. And maybe I'm just assuming, but it can be psychologically stressful to think like that. To have a standard so high that if you can't reach it, then what's the use of being a moral person? Especially people of faith who view the world in black and white. Movies can make an impact, but religious movies should be taken precautiously because they're not always gonna be faithful to their religious roots. Some might take liberties because they want to express how they perceive religion. To me, The Passion represents Mel's personal complexities. It is his way to interpret what good and evil look like to him with all of his imperfections. And you can get a sense that religion is a rooted part of him, since he's the one holding the nail in the scene. It might sound diminishing to just say it's just a movie for the impact that it made and for how many felt harmed by it. But if people would stop seeing it as a representation of their fate and just a director's point of view about religion, then it would be safe to say it's just a movie. It's a pity that its religious tone has undermined its technical production, special effects, and makeup, because it's got some great underrated work. It was nominated in the Oscars for Best Makeup, Best Cinematography, and Best Music Score, which sadly, it didn't win any of them. Still, it was nice to be recognized in the Academy. The film was made in Italy, in a town that felt close resemblance to a 1,000-year-old Judean city. The sets were close to where Martin Scorsese filmed Gangsters of New York. They would destroy what was remaining from his set and build on top of it their own sets, like Pontius Pilate's courtroom. Christian Tinsley was in charge of James' makeup, from the bruises to the dismembered body. For the dismembered body, he used temporary prosthetic tattoos that would cover up all of James' body. The look of it is grotesque and horrific, but in a good way. It looks juicy enough that you never imagined he was wearing any makeup on. For what little effects they had, they did a good job blending the effects with what was real, that you can't tell the difference from what is fake. For the flagellation, the soldiers were only using the hand stick, but without the leather spikes. It would be later added with CGI, as well as the wound would be covered up with it, so then later revealed after the strike. For the nailing of the hand, they shot a variation of props separately so they could mash them together. One was James' reaction to the pain with his hand inside of the cross. The other was a rubber palm that was secure enough to nail it through. Even the fingers would have another hand coming underneath the cross. It's a small detail effect, but it looks impressive because you can't tell the difference that it's fake. Sometimes they would use a duplicate dummy of Jim for whenever they turned the cross backwards. The puppet looked so convincingly that when a priest saw it on set, he thought that Jim wasn't breathing anymore. For the God tier, they would shot separately the body, the smoke, the drop of water, and blend them together the same way as they did with the nailing scene. They would also mix the top of the real crucifixion set with a background miniature that would later be added in the photography. For the temple split, they would place two cameras together and separate them instantaneously to give it a sense of a powerful earthquake. Later it would be added together with CGI and miniatures. The cinematography by Caleb this channel is absolutely gorgeous to look at. Most of the movie is shot in slow motion that was meant to look as if they were paintings that moved. It's able to capture its religious artistry into a grand scale that made it seem as if it were big. The music score by John Debney is one of my favorite soundtracks in movie history. It's one of those movies I can watch from the beginning all the way to the end credits so I can listen to it with such relief that the difficult parts are finally over. His music contains a variation of ancient flutes, choirs, lullabies that can give it a church-like Middle East religious experience. Sometimes it's dark and gloomy, and other times it's choiry and dramatic. And it manages to work very well. One scene where the music works perfectly is when Mary goes to Jesus after his second fall. The addition of flashbacks when Jesus was a baby made it into a heartbreaking scene for witnessing his human side. It drove many people into tears, and this also made me tear up as well. At this point, we witnessed so much of its brutality that we needed something to release our stress. The music goes from depressing, dramatic, and bombastically loud and choiry, but it doesn't feel hammy or forced. It worked through making itself feel big, loud, and dramatic, and it earns it. I don't feel ashamed to admit that I have seen most of the Jesus movies that America, the British, and even Latin America had to offer. This wasn't anything forced down on me, it was something I genuinely had an interest in. Each one is different in their own way, whether it's for converting or for an epic cash grab, while some are products of their time reflecting their social changes. Through the 20s and 60s, Jesus was a more traditional interpretation of the Bible, representing how conservative the West was. The 70s was opening up to questioning religion and to see how far could they push the envelope in order to make their points across. Jesus Christ Superstar would take the first step to make the hard questions musical style. But seriously, just to imagine Herod interrogating Jesus while dancing is kinda hilarious.
Come on, King of the Jews.
Heck, if we're going to that route, might as well turn it into a comedy in Life of Brian.
Always look on the bright side of life.
By the late 80s and 2000s, we then started to question the divinity of Jesus in the Da Vinci Code and in Martin Scorsese's controversial depiction of The Last Temptation of Christ. At first I was considering making a comparison of The Last Temptation with The Passion because they both were as controversial, as they both made religious masses angry and were based off from different sources. But if I had to make a brief comparison to not only which one is more thought-provoking, but the most controversial, then in that case, it would be The Last Temptation. The Passion may have angered a lot of Jews for its gory, anti-Semitic complaints, but it still follows a traditional portrayal of Jesus that no Christian would argue with. However, in The Last Temptation, Jesus is portrayed less divine and more as a man who had sin, had doubts, didn't always know what he was doing, and even tried to abandon his mission, and enraged a lot of Christians because of that. But as I mentioned earlier, religious movies are not meant to represent fate. They are meant to represent what the director's beliefs are. Scorsese wasn't attacking Christianity, as he once tried to become a priest. He just took a different direction to make Jesus relatable as a human that could be hurt, instead of the God that nothing hurts him. He as well encompassed what people make of religion. It can be love, extremism, misinterpretation, and martyrdom. Now, that is not to say that Mel's Jesus is a bland one. To its credit, I find him to be as closely mysterious as the one from Ben-Hur. The movie is very brief about his backstory, so if you don't know anything about the Bible, this will leave enough room for some intrigue about who he was. You get the idea that he was a good man, but you don't get why he would allow to be abused this severely. Due to Jim's conservative political views, he wouldn't be casted as much in Hollywood since then. Fortunately, he has done alright with his life. He seems to be happy sharing his conservative views and appearing once in a while in movies. During the Passion set, poor guy, he suffered a lot there. He had to endure 8 hours of makeup, barely had any sleep, had to carry an actual heavy cross, dislocated his shoulder, got accidentally hit twice in the flagellation, suffered pneumonia for how cold the weather was in the crucifixion. Oh, and let's not forget the infamous lightning bolt that hit him on top of the cross. I mean, they pretty much were tossing him like a bag of potatoes. Ouch. Whatever reason Jesus actors are blacklisted can be for political reasons and not because of religion. And most of them are not even blacklisted. I mean, for a time, Hollywood used to love those epic religious movies, and some went on to do further things in their career. Whatever Jesus interpretation you find to be your favorite, mine was Robert Powell in Jesus of Nazareth. Each one is different in their own way that makes them interesting. Whether if it's more traditional, more artistic, or cinematic, or just plain different. As the years have gone by, The Passion has been viewed favorably by Christians, but has gotten less popular in the movie community, as it contains a lower score in Rotten Tomatoes. I'll be honest to say, this is not an easy movie to defend. It has so much controversy working against it, including the director himself. It has been considered as a snuff film that focuses on the torture instead of the message of love Jesus preached. Movie fans have been turned off by Mel's recent accusations and behavior. Though to be clear, I'm not taking away any responsibility that he might have had. I'm just asking, how much did the media shape Mel's attitude to the point of becoming what they said he was? Whether you think he's crazy or playing off to the religious people, at least he knows how to make a good story. Lately he has stayed away from trouble, and apparently his bad image seems to have worn off after the Academy acknowledged his movie Jacksaw Ridge for Best Picture nominee. There's been a lot of tease that he's working on a Passion sequel that would bring back the original cast together, including Jim Caviezel as the role of Jesus. It would take place during the 3 days Jesus was dead in the underworld. Now that is something I would be looking forward to seeing. I don't know if it's gonna be good or biblically cohesive, but at least I'm expecting it to be a deep, crazy philosophical original piece. If The Passion made Mel Gibson's career suffer, this would be poetic irony if the sequel were to resurrect it. Despite all of its criticisms, the movie goes in a deep personal route with me that I don't care how others view it. Personally, it brings me back to a time when I was very religious in my early teenage years, and I have some good fun memories of that. As time has gone by, that devotion and mindset has almost faded away. There are days where I want to believe there is a God, and other days where I don't. My only fear is that if he is real, that he might not be as good or understanding of us as we thought he would be. As I mentioned earlier, passion plays and crucifixions used to scare me as a kid, and I never thought I would get over it from the movie that is all about crucifixions. The more I saw it, the more I noticed how good their technicality was, that I wanted to go back and see it again, their cinematography, listen to how good their music was, and even be broken by Mary going to Jesus. If there is something you should know about me is, I don't cry in movies at all. None of these suckers made me cry in the past, and I thought nothing would ever do so. And surprisingly, the one that broke me was the one that I feared the most. The violence doesn't bother me as much anymore, though it is a theme that keeps popping up in every movie Mel has directed. Whether if it's gothic, or gory, or just plain torture, he does seem to be fascinated with it as if it were art, and at times it does look like art. But do I believe it would have been this over the top? Absolutely not. No man would have survived such brutal beating, I don't care if you're a messiah. Though I can make a small defense that the violence revolutionized how we interpret the suffering of Christ. We know that flogging and crucifixions are painful, that's common sense, but before, we never knew how severely Roman punishment was. Hollywood has given us clean, unblemished, almost painless sufferings of Christ, to what supposedly sparked a new movement because of his suffering. Aside of that, it is not an easy movie to get through. Admittedly, it is downright depressing. The only times that is not depressing are during the flashbacks and this guy's laugh. I don't know why I crack up every time I see him. I mean, he sounds like a chicken getting an orgy from laying eggs. For the subtitles, Mel considered not using them at first. He was hoping that everybody would get what they were saying based on their acting. But for other scenes like their political talks, they had to have subtitles to know what they were saying, which thankfully they added them. From all the Christ movies, this one feels more set apart for its language barrier, as well as for being the most horror tone of all of its religious movies. It was made to sound different, which if you translate it to a familiar language, it loses all of its uniqueness. One time they passed it on a Hispanic channel dubbed in Spanish, and it wasn't the same because you could tell how simple the dialogue and slowly paced it was. When listening into it in a different language, I never felt that. I also wonder why they never subtitled the Romans during the flagellation, which to my surprise is because they were saying vulgar slangs and they needed to be censored. Because you don't want to have the Bible and Jesus be associated with the F word. The Passion has its pros and cons on converting others. There's been testimonies of people reconnecting to their faith after seeing the movie, and even murderers that turn in after seeing The Passion. On the other hand, it has given elder ladies heart attacks during the nailing scene. This is not for everyone, and probably shouldn't be. Though I am not against sharing it with other friends, what I am against is using it as propaganda for wrong reasons, or to force it on someone because of their religion. Nobody should be forced to sit through and watch something that they're not ready for, especially kids. It's a two-edged sword that can give a good or a bad experience. I had the experience from both sides of it, one by getting over my fear and learning to appreciate it for its technical production more than for its religious tone. It manages to combine other Christ movies and still be its own thing. It is vaguely artistic as the Gospel of St. Matthew, it is epically shot as in Ben-Hur, and is as controversial as The Last Temptation. I can understand if some find the movie to be bad for all the blood emphasis. It's not the most story-driven from all the Christ movies, and while the message of love is not as emphasized, it is still there and can even be shown visually when Jesus wants to wash one of his tormentors' feet. I don't mind the changes they made, like Mary becoming a central focus. It is one person's interpretation of the Bible with all of its imperfections. Now, that doesn't mean I'm anti-Semitic or support hate speech. It's just that this hit me emotionally that I can give it a pass with all of its controversy. However, if the sequel does come out and says or does something inappropriate, then I won't be able to give it a pass. Whatever your views are, we can talk about in the comment section respectfully. I wouldn't recommend children to see this, but if you're someone that's interested in seeing it, but is afraid of its score? Well, here's some advice for you. Have a pillow ready and make sure that mute button works. But seriously, his laugh though.
Pasito tung tung, pasito tung tung.